By the fall of the year 1974, police across 5 states were hunting a man who'd already confessed to more murders than almost anyone in American history. But when they finally caught up to him in the back of a police car, surrounded by the very officers meant to bring him in safely, what happened next is something almost nobody saw coming. Before you hear what this man did, you need to understand what made him so effective at doing it. He wasn't frightening to look at, he wasn't cold or distant. By almost every account from people who survived meeting him, and even from people who didn't, he was charming. His name was Paul Knowles. The press would later call him the Casanova Killer. Knowles was born in Orlando, Florida, in 1946. His early life gave few clues about what he'd become. He moved between relatives and foster homes for much of his childhood and was sent more than once to a state-run institution for boys with a documented, troubling history of how it treated the children in its care. Whatever happened to him there was never fully documented, but those who knew him as a teenager described someone who'd learned early how to read people, what to say, how to act, how to make an impression. He was first incarcerated at 19, and for the next decade and a half, prison would become the backdrop of his adult life. A cycle of sentences, releases, and returns. Here's where the charm first shows up clearly. In early 1974, while serving time at Ryford Prison in Florida, Knowles began writing letters to a divorced woman named Angela in San Francisco. He had nothing to offer her. No job, no money, no freedom. And yet, purely through correspondence, he convinced her to fall for him. She paid for his legal counsel. By the time he was released, they were engaged. But the moment he stepped off the plane in California to be with her, something about him in person didn't match the man in the letters. She called off the wedding within hours and later said he gave off what she described as an aura of fear, something she couldn't quite name but couldn't ignore either. Knowles returned to Florida, unraveling. Within weeks, he was arrested again, this time for stabbing a bartender during a fight. This time, unlike every arrest before it, he didn't wait around to see what would happen in court. On the 26th of July 1974, Knowles picked the lock of his holding cell and simply walked out. What followed was a 4-month crime spree across multiple states, and the same quality that had charmed a stranger into an engagement from behind bars was about to make him one of the most difficult killers law enforcement had ever tried to track. There was no single pattern to chase, no consistent type of victim, no way to know, meeting him, which version of him you'd get. The very night of his escape, he broke into the home of a 5-year-old widow in Jacksonville, gagged her during a robbery, and stole her car. She suffocated during the struggle. It was the first of what would become at least 18 confirmed deaths, though Knowles himself would later claim, in taped confessions he mailed to an attorney, that the true number was closer to double that. Those tapes were reviewed once by a grand jury in 1975 and were later destroyed when the federal courthouse holding them flooded, meaning much of what he confessed to may never be fully known. Over the following weeks, Knowles moved through Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Nevada, Texas, and further still. And this is the part that made investigators' jobs nearly impossible. He killed for completely different reasons each time, in completely different ways. Sometimes for a car, sometimes for money. Sometimes, it seemed, simply because the opportunity presented itself and nothing stopped him from taking it. He strangled a woman he'd met at a bar that same day and stole her television on the way out the door. He forced his way into a young mother's home, killing her but leaving her 3-year-old son physically untouched, a detail investigators could never explain. He picked up 2 elderly campers at a rest stop and left in their vehicle. A woman reported missing by her family turned up days later along a roadside, states away from where she'd last been seen. Some of what happened during this stretch is almost too dark to fully detail. Among his victims were several children, whose deaths remain some of the most disturbing parts of this entire case, and in at least one home invasion, evidence showed he'd gone as far as assaulting the body of a teenage victim after killing her. We won't dwell on what occurred in those cases, only on the fact that it did, and on the reminder of exactly what he was capable of when nothing was holding him back. And here's the part that should unsettle you more than any of that. Not everyone he encountered died. In fact, some of the people who spent the most time with him walked away completely unharmed. A British journalist spent several days travelling with him and later described him, unsettlingly, as impressive looking and easy to talk to. Nothing about him hinted at what he was capable of. 2 hitchhikers he picked up were let go entirely unharmed, dropped off safely in Miami. One woman he travelled with for over a week appears to have paid their expenses along the way. It was never entirely clear whether she was a hostage or had simply been drawn in by him, right up until he later claimed to have killed her too. Same man. Wildly different outcomes, sometimes within the same week. That was the truly frightening part of this case. There was no version of how to stay safe around him that actually made sense, because his own behaviour never followed a pattern anyone could predict. But by mid-November, something changed. The randomness that had made Knowles impossible to profile started narrowing toward a single, far more reckless target: the police themselves. On November 14, he invaded a home in West Palm Beach, abducted one of the women inside, and fled in her car. 2 days later, a Florida Highway Patrol trooper spotted that same stolen vehicle and moved in to make an arrest a routine stop, the kind made every day. But Knowles wrestled the trooper's own weapon away from him and took him hostage inside his own patrol car. Then, using the vehicle's siren, he pulled over a completely unrelated motorist on the road and forced him in as a second hostage. The man who'd spent 4 months surviving on unpredictability had just made the one move guaranteed to bring every law enforcement agency in the region down on him at once, and this time, there would be no walking away. Knowles drove both hostages into a wooded area in Pulaski County, Georgia. He handcuffed them to a tree, then he shot them both. Within hours, he was in a high-speed chase with sheriff's deputies, weaving through traffic before crashing straight through a police roadblock, injuring an officer in the collision. He abandoned the car and ran on foot into the woods, pursued now by police dogs, officers from multiple agencies, and a helicopter circling overhead. At one point during the chase, he was shot in the foot by a pursuing detective, but he kept moving anyway, refusing to go down easily. In the end, it wasn't a SWAT team or a coordinated manhunt unit that finally cornered him. It was a Vietnam veteran out hunting that day with his own shotgun who happened to cross paths with him in a clearing and simply held him there at gunpoint until investigators could arrive. If that one hunter hadn't been in the woods at that exact moment, Knowles may well have slipped past the entire perimeter of law enforcement searching for him. For the first time in 4 months, Paul Knowles wasn't the one deciding what happened next. He was arrested and taken into custody. Over the following weeks, he reportedly confessed to crime after crime, some of which investigators hadn't even connected to him yet, and some, like the killing of a 13-year-old girl in Georgia, that wouldn't be confirmed by authorities until months after his death. But Paul Knowles never faced a single one of those charges in a courtroom. On the 18th of December 1974, he was being driven down a Georgia interstate, handcuffed in the back seat, on his way to confirm the location of a weapon tied to one of his confessions. 2 law enforcement officers rode with him, the same kind of people he'd spent 4 months evading, outsmarting, and, on more than one occasion, charming his way past entirely. And true to everything you now know about him, he made one final, unpredictable move. He lunged forward and grabbed for the sheriff's handgun. In the struggle that followed, the second agent in the car fired 3 shots into his chest, He was killed instantly, not by a jury, not by a courtroom, not by any of the painstaking investigative work that multiple states had spent months carrying out to finally catch him. The most dangerous thing about Paul Knowles, right up until his final moment, was that no one, not his victims, not the people he let live, and not even the two officers driving him to confirm his own confession, could ever quite predict what he'd do next. It's what let him survive as long as he did. And in the end, it's exactly what got him killed.